America's most misunderstood commander-in-chief. History loves simple labels. Hero, failure, strong, weak. But some presidencies refuse to fit inside clean definitions. This is a story of a commander-in-chief whose decisions are still argued over. Not because they were reckless, but because they were misunderstood. At the moment this president took office, the nation was exhausted, confidence was low, institutions were strained. The public wanted strength, but feared escalation. They wanted security, but dreaded another catastrophe. And they wanted leadership that could hold the line without crossing it. That balance would define everything that followed. From the outside, this presidency often appeared cautious, restrained, even hesitant. Critics accused the commander-in-chief of lacking resolve, of avoiding decisive action when force was available. Supporters saw something else entirely, a leader who understood the cost of power because he had seen it up close. To understand why this president remains so misunderstood, we have to look beyond headlines and outcomes and into the context of the choices being made. The threats were real, but they were fragmented. No clear enemy, no single battlefield, just pressure coming from every direction at once. Every decision carried invisible consequences. Escalation risked dragging the nation into conflicts with no clear end. Restraint risked appearing weak to allies and adversaries alike. And unlike past wars, there will be no decisive victory to reset the narrative. This commander-in-chief chose containment over confrontation, precision over spectacle, and long-term stability over short-term applause. At the time, that choice frustrated nearly everyone. But what history rarely explains is what this president was trying to avoid. Not defeat, but entanglement. Not loss of power, but loss of control. Because sometimes the hardest command decision isn't when to act, it's when not to. And that choice would define how this presidency is remembered and misunderstood to this day. Behind every restrained decision was a calculation few people saw. Intelligence briefings warn of cascading consequences. Military options look clean on paper, but messy in reality. Every strike carried the risk of retaliation, escalation, and long-term entrenchment. The president understood that modern conflict no longer ended with surrender. It metastasized. One intervention created 3 more problems. One show of force invited asymmetric response. Power was no longer about dominance. It was about containment. Critics demanded action. Allies demanded reassurance. Adversaries tested boundaries. And inside the administration, the pressure to do something was constant. But doing something didn't always mean doing the right thing. This commander-in-chief favored limited engagement, operations designed to disrupt rather than dominate, quiet decisions, narrow objectives, minimal visibility. The goal wasn't victory. It was management. That approach frustrated a public raised on clear endings. Wars won, enemies defeated. But this era offered none of that. Only trade-offs, only risk mitigation. And every time restraint was chosen, it carried a cost. Accusations of weakness, lost political capital, eroded approval. But the alternative carried a different price. One paid in lives, instability, and consequences that would last far longer than any presidency. What history often overlooks is the discipline required to absorb criticism without reacting to it, to withstand pressure without escalating simply to prove strength, to lead without spectacle. This presidency wasn't defined by what happened. It was defined by what didn't. And that made it harder to explain and easier to misjudge. As time passed, the restraint that defined this presidency began to reveal its deeper consequences. Not dramatic victories, not visible defeats, but a slow accumulation of unresolved tension that refused to disappear. Conflicts didn't end. They stabilized. Threats didn't vanish. They adapted. The absence of escalation kept wars from expanding, but it also meant they never fully closed. This created a strange historical paradox. The nation avoided catastrophe, yet never felt secure. Inside the White House, this was understood. The goal had never been peace in the traditional sense. It was control, preventing collapse, preventing spillover, preventing a single decision from triggering consequences that could no longer be contained. But outside, patience eroded. Critics argue that restraint emboldened adversaries, that hesitation invited challenge, that lines not enforced eventually stopped existing. Supporters countered that restraint prevented far worse outcomes, ones that would only become obvious in hindsight. Both were partially right. This is what made the presidency so difficult to judge. The outcomes were invisible by design. The disasters avoided could never be proven. And without visible success, perception hardened into frustration. Leadership in this era demanded accepting a truth few leaders embrace. That success may look like stagnation. That restraint may feel like weakness. And that history may never credit what didn't happen. By the end of the term, the nation was still standing. No major war had exploded. No single catastrophe had consumed everything else. But the questions remained. Was stability enough? Or had the cost of containment simply been delayed? This is why the presidency remains misunderstood, because it operated in a space where winning wasn't possible, only surviving. And survival rarely satisfies anyone watching from the outside. When this presidency ended, there was no clear verdict, no moment of triumph, no undeniable failure, just a country that felt uneasy, uncertain whether it had been protected or merely postponed. History struggled to measure what couldn't be seen. The wars that didn't expand, the crises that didn't explode, the lines that held just long enough to avoid disaster. These outcomes don't fit neatly into textbooks or speeches. They leave no monuments. And so the story hardened into misunderstanding. Some remembered hesitation. Others remembered caution. But few recognized the weight of what had been carried. The constant pressure to act loudly in a world that punished restraint. The discipline required to absorb criticism rather than escalate for approval. This presidency forces an uncomfortable question. Do we judge leaders by what they achieve or by what they prevent? Because power exercised carefully rarely looks heroic. It looks quiet, incomplete, unsatisfying. And in a political culture addicted to action, that restraint is easily mistaken for weakness. Yet the consequences of unchecked action are well known. Escalation without exit, conflicts without end, decisions that feel strong in the moment and devastating later. This commander-in-chief chose to live inside that tension, to hold the line without crossing it, to lead without spectacle, to accept misunderstanding as the price of caution. Whether history will ever fully appreciate that choice remains uncertain. But the lesson remains. Sometimes the most consequential leadership decision isn't how forcefully power is used. It's how carefully it is withheld. So, what do you think? Was restraint the right command in a world demanding action? America